All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today's selection of writings is a really fascinating one, don't you think? It's all about this complex interplay between religion, faith, and reason.
It really is. We're going to try to unpack some of the key arguments and observations about religious belief from these sources, how it impacts our individual lives, and also how it plays out on a larger societal scale.
So, our goal today is to go beyond just summarizing these writings. We're going to try to extract those core insights. What's the so what of all these different viewpoints on religion and its relationship with reason, with human behavior? We're going to give you a concentrated look at what really matters in this whole discussion.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's dive right in. One of the sources really challenges this whole idea of respect for religion. It questions this automatic deference that we seem to give to religious beliefs, often putting them on a pedestal compared to other ways of thinking. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what's interesting here is this questioning of why religious ideas are often treated with kid gloves. Why aren't they subjected to the same kind of critical examination that we readily apply to scientific claims, to political ideologies, even to just our everyday assumptions about the world?
Right, like there's this hesitation to use the same analytical tools we use elsewhere.
Exactly.
And it's not just a theoretical concern either. One of the sources even mentions a letter from the president of the New Jersey History Society actually expressing fear of potentially destroying someone's faith. They're literally arguing for faith over knowledge.
It's a powerful example of how the prioritization of belief can sometimes overshadow the pursuit of knowledge. It suggests this deep-seated belief that protecting faith, even from intellectual scrutiny, is paramount. And it's not just confined to intellectual discussions either.
Right, because then you have those real-world examples of this elevated status granted to religion, like the example of military exemptions. Often it's a much smoother process to get out of service for religious reasons than for deeply held philosophical objections to war, even if those objections are based on years of rigorous ethical thought.
That's a great point. It shows how this special treatment of religion can be embedded in our institutions. The contrast with philosophical objections really highlights a potential bias toward religiously based exemptions.
And then you have the controversy surrounding the Danish cartoons. The author really hones in on the intense, sometimes violent outrage that happened in response, contrasting that with the lack of similar widespread condemnation for anti-Jewish cartoons that have appeared in Arab media.
It's a really important observation. While condemning the violence unequivocally, the author's point is about this asymmetry of reaction. On the one hand, there's this deep respect shown for the offense, felt by some over mere drawings. But on the other hand, similar or even worse depictions targeting other groups don't generate the same global outcry. So what we see here is how culturally determined our outrage can be, with some symbols deemed so sacred that even representing them artistically can provoke a violent response.
Really makes you think about the power of that cultural context. Now, one of the sources really tackles the very idea of God's existence head on, proposing that we treat God not as a given, but as a hypothesis to be examined.
Right, and the author doesn't shy away from offering a very critical portrayal of the Old Testament God, using terms like jealous, controlling, unjust, even genocidal to describe this deity. It's a deliberate attempt to look at these texts with fresh eyes.
It definitely makes you confront those descriptions. And the suggestion that our familiarity with these stories might actually desensitize us to some of those more troubling aspects is interesting, right? It makes me think about how someone encountering these texts for the first time without that baggage might have a much different reaction.
Absolutely. Repeated exposure can normalize things that might initially seem extreme. Now, just for clarity, the author mentions using God as a general term for any deity.
Right. Whether it's one god or many gods, they're using God for simplicity. They also acknowledge the masculine portrayal of the Abrahamic God, but they point out that there are ongoing theological discussions about God's gender.
It's a good reminder that we're dealing with concepts that are often abstract and difficult to define.
Now, here's something that I always found puzzling. The United States, despite having a secular founding, is so much more overtly religious than a country like England, which has an established church. One of your sources offers some possible explanations for this, right?
Yes. One idea is that England might have experienced a kind of weariness with religious fervor after centuries of conflict and having a state-sanctioned religion. It's like a pendulum swing. On the other hand, in the U.S., many immigrants found a sense of community and belonging in churches, especially in those early days. It was a kind of surrogate family.
So churches served a very specific social function.
Right? They provided that social network, that support system. that many immigrants needed.
I remember one of the sources had a quote about the Church of England having immunized the English against Christianity, and the author actually expressed concern about a resurgence of religious fanaticism.
It's a sobering thought. Like, even periods of relative secularism might not be permanent.
It makes you wonder, what would the Founding Fathers think about the current state of affairs in the U.S. with the prominence of religion in public life?
Well, given their emphasis on the separation of church and state, I think they'd be deeply concerned. Think about those public displays of the Ten Commandments, for example.
That's a great example. And speaking of taking action, one of the sources features a call to action from Tom Flynn, who urges atheists to step up and become more vocal.
Right? He's pointing out that there's strength in numbers. It challenges this idea of religion being this unchallenged force in society.
And one final point in this section, a rather disturbing anecdote from David Mills. He talks about encountering police intolerance when he tried to organize a peaceful protest against a faith healer who was discouraging medical treatment.
It really highlights how ingrained that deference to religious claims can be, even when those claims might have harmful consequences.
Let's move on to some definitions now. Specifically, agnosticism and atheism. One of your sources discusses Huxley's creation of the term agnosticism.
And what's important here is that Huxley was drawing a distinction between knowledge and belief. He argued that agnosticism is about acknowledging the limits of our knowledge, particularly when it comes to questions like God's existence, while atheism is a statement of non-belief.
So agnosticism is saying, I don't know, and atheism is saying, I don't believe.
Precisely. And then the source uses Russell's famous teapot analogy, which is a really brilliant way to illustrate this. Just because you can't definitively disprove the existence of a teapot orbiting the sun doesn't mean we should treat that claim as equally valid as claims backed by evidence.
So the burden of proof lies with the person making the positive claim.
Exactly. And then there's that amusing little update about a sacred teapot incident in Malaysia, which just goes to show you reality can be stranger than fiction.
Speaking of reality, let's talk about this often assumed boundary between science and religion. One of your sources really questions this whole idea of there being these ultimate questions that science can't answer, where religion gets to step in and offer answers.
Right. This idea of non-overlapping magisteria, or noma, suggests that science and religion operate in separate domains. Science deals with the natural world, religion deals with meaning, purpose, the supernatural.
But the author pushes back on this, asking why religion should have this special privilege.
Exactly. Why should certain types of questions be off limits to scientific inquiry? Especially when those questions touch on things that science also investigates, like the origins of the universe or the nature of consciousness.
Martin Rees, the astronomer royal, proposes that the ultimate mystery of existence belongs to philosophy and theology. But the author doesn't seem convinced.
They question what the legitimate domain of theologians actually is, what methods they use. They even mention this story about an Oxford warden who was skeptical of Christian theology as a valid research topic. So it really comes down to the type of evidence and the methods of inquiry that we consider acceptable.
Which leads us to a very practical question. Does prayer actually work? The source discusses what they call the Great Prayer Experiment, a scientific study designed to investigate this.
It's a fascinating area where religious claims have been put to the test. If praying for someone's recovery actually has a tangible effect, we should, in principle, be able to measure that.
It's worth noting that this wasn't the first attempt to scientifically investigate the power of prayer. Back in the 19th century, Francis Galton, who was Charles Darwin's cousin, did a study on whether all the public prayers for the health of the British royal family had any measurable effect on their longevity.
Galton's study was a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it raised a valid point. If prayer really had this direct impact, we might expect to see some statistical correlation.
So this Great Prayer Experiment involved patients undergoing cardiac bypass surgery. They were divided into 3 groups: those who received prayers without knowing it, those who didn't receive prayers and didn't know it, and those who received prayers and were aware of it. And they used a standardized prayer request for all those who were prayed for.
Standardizing the prayer is crucial for trying to isolate the variable you're testing in this case, the power of prayer.
So what did they find?
Well, the results were pretty surprising. The study didn't find any statistically significant difference in the recovery rates between the groups. There was even a slight, though not statistically significant, trend towards worse outcomes for the group that knew they were being prayed for. So the takeaway here is that when prayer was put to the test in this very rigorous way, it didn't demonstrate any measurable effect on recovery.
Very interesting. Now let's talk about creationism versus evolution. One of the sources points out a rather unexpected common ground between the author and creationists. They both reject this idea of non-overlapping magisteria.
That's right. They both see this question of origins, how life arose on Earth, as a point of conflict between science and religion. It's not separate domains for them.
And the source even mentions this tactic that creationists often use, targeting evolutionary biologists who are openly atheist.
It's a way of trying to discredit the science by attacking the personal beliefs of the scientists. It's exploiting the prejudice that some people have against atheists, trying to make them seem untrustworthy.
And the author is very upfront about the fact that their understanding of evolution did actually influence their atheism. They contrast that with the more legally cautious, but perhaps less honest approach of claiming that your personal beliefs don't affect your scientific work.
That honesty is refreshing. It acknowledges that our scientific knowledge can shape our worldview.
To really illustrate the illogical demands sometimes made by creationists, the author uses this brilliant analogy. They talk about demanding a complete step-by-step film recording of every single stage in a murder case before you can accept the verdict.
It's a great analogy because we don't need a continuous video to establish guilt. The same applies to evolution. We don't need a perfect fossil record with every transition documented to have confidence in the overall process.
Right, and the source makes it clear that the evidence for evolution goes way beyond just fossils. There's evidence from genetics, from comparative anatomy, from the distribution of species around the world.
It's a really strong convergent body of evidence from multiple fields.
And then there's J.B.S. Haldane's famous quip, "Rabbits in the Precambrian." What a great way to encapsulate the idea that if we found a rabbit fossil in those ancient layers of rock, it would completely overturn our understanding of evolution. But guess what? We haven't found any Precambrian rabbit.
It highlights the testability of evolutionary theory. If you found something like that, it would be a major scientific revolution.
Okay, let's move on to another big question, the anthropic principle. One of the sources discusses this observation that the universe seems remarkably fine-tuned for life.
The anthropic principle, in its basic form, just observes that the physical constants of the universe seem to have values that allow for life as we know it.
Martin Rees gives this list of 6 fundamental constants, and he explains that even slight variations in their values would have made the universe completely inhospitable to life.
It's a remarkable observation. But it's important to remember that the anthropic principle, in itself, doesn't explain why these constants have the values they do.
Now, let's consider an argument that's sometimes put forward for theism. The idea that it's a very simple explanation because it posits just one substance, God, as the cause of everything.
That's Swinburne's argument for the simplicity of theism. But the author counters that by pointing out the inherent complexity of a God who's actively creating and maintaining every single detail of this vast universe.
Right. It's like having a zillion fingers on every electron.
Exactly. It doesn't sound so simple when you think of it that way.
The core claim of theism is that God is ultimately responsible for everything that exists, all their properties and all their actions. But the author points out that there's a tension here, right?
The tension lies in reconciling the idea of this single unified cause, an all-powerful, all-knowing God, with the incredible diversity, complexity, and apparent randomness of the universe.
Let's shift gears now and look at some more personal perspectives. Your source includes John Horgan's reflections on his interactions with religious believers.
What's interesting is that while Horgan's own skepticism didn't waver, he gained a deeper understanding of why intelligent people might find meaning in religious belief.
And then there's his comment about the Templeton Foundation, which aims to bridge science and religion, potentially furthering his own ideal of a world without religion. It's an interesting paradox.
He's suggesting that by promoting this dialogue, the Templeton Foundation might inadvertently lead to a more critical examination of religious claims, ultimately weakening the hold of religion.
Then you have Freeman Dyson's acceptance speech for the Templeton Prize, where he cites Hitler and Stalin as examples of atheistic demons.
And the author rightly pushes back on that, pointing out that blaming their atrocities on atheism ignores the complex political and social factors at play.
And the author also expresses concern about the sheer size of the Templeton Prize, how it's explicitly trying to rival the Nobel Prize.
The worry is that it might influence the direction of scientific research, encouraging people to look for harmony between science and religion, even when it's not there.
Now, let's talk about how evolutionary biology might shed light on religion, starting with this core principle of natural selection. No inherent purpose.
Right. Natural selection just favors traits that enhance survival and reproduction.
But then we see things like the peacock's tail, which seems totally extravagant.
That's where sexual selection comes in. The peacock's tail is a signal to attract mates.
And even weird behaviors like anting in birds, where they rub themselves with ants, likely have some underlying benefit.
Exactly. Natural selection favors behaviors that increase the chances of passing on genes. So why is religion, which can be costly in terms of time, resources, and even conflict, so widespread?
It's such a pervasive human trait that it seems to demand a Darwinian explanation.
Right, it can't just be random chance.
Now, some people argue that religion fulfills our curiosity or provides comfort, but the source critiques those explanations.
The point is that while religion might do those things, it doesn't explain why our minds would find comfort in things that might not be true.
So what are some potential Darwinian explanations?
Well, one idea is group selection. Groups that cooperate might outcompete others. But historically, it's often the groups with the best individuals, not necessarily the most altruistic groups, that succeed.
Darwin himself saw it more as ecological competition, like how gray squirrels replaced red squirrels.
Right. This brings us to the concept of byproducts in evolution. Some traits arise as unintended consequences of other adaptations, like moths being drawn to light.
Their navigational system, which uses starlight, gets messed up by artificial light.
Exactly. So the idea is that religion might be a byproduct of other cognitive abilities that evolved for different reasons.
Like our ability to understand other people's minds or our tendency to favor our own group.
Right. Paul Bloom argues that children's natural dualism, seeing the mind as separate from the body, makes them receptive to ideas of spirits and deities.
And there's infantile teleology, the belief that everything has a purpose.
Which could make children predisposed to accepting a divine creator as the ultimate purpose giver.
And then Dennett even suggests that religious irrationality might be tied to the same brain mechanisms that make us irrational when we're in love.
It's a fascinating connection. Helen Fisher's work shows that romantic love can override our rational decision-making.
So maybe some of that same neural circuitry gets activated in religious belief.
It's still speculative, but it's a really interesting idea.
Now, let's consider how memes and cultural evolution might shape the specific forms that religions take.
Right. While our genes might make us receptive to religious ideas, the specific details, the doctrines, the rituals, those are likely shaped by cultural evolution.
The source talks about memes, units of cultural information that get replicated and passed on.
The question is whether these memes function like genes, undergoing a process of selection and evolution.
Like learning to hammer a nail, the core skill gets transmitted even if each person does it slightly differently.
Right. Or think about knitting stitches or knots or origami folds. Those are cultural elements that get replicated with a high degree of fidelity.
The source even suggests a thought experiment. Imagine copying a boat design versus copying origami instructions through multiple generations. The origami instructions are more likely to stay accurate.
It shows how the clarity and replicability of information is important for a meme to survive. So, what makes a religious meme successful?
Well, the source gives a list of examples. The promise of an afterlife, rewards for martyrdom, punishment for heresy, belief in God as a supreme virtue, discouraging doubt, accepting mysteries, things like that.
Those are powerful memes that can really take hold in a culture.
So, while organized religions are structured by people, the specific forms they take might be shaped by this unconscious process of mimetic evolution. It's not just deliberate design.
It's like natural selection working on cultural information. Those memes that are good at spreading and surviving will become more common.
In the early stages of a religion, it might be those simple, emotionally appealing memes that take hold.
Like we talked about with the byproduct theories. But then, as religions become more complex, even arbitrary or counterintuitive memes can survive if they're part of a larger, interconnected system of beliefs.
The source uses the example of cargo cults to illustrate how cultural contact and new belief systems can have unintended consequences.
Cargo cults are a fascinating example of how people try to make sense of the material success of another culture, often misinterpreting the causes and creating rituals based on those misunderstandings.
Like the John Frum cult on Tana, where they rejected Western ways and waited for a mythical figure to bring them prosperity.
It shows how the search for meaning and agency can lead to the adoption of belief systems based on incomplete or inaccurate information.
Let's move on to morality now. A lot of people think morality comes from religion, but the source challenges that idea.
Right. The author suggests that we can look at morality through an evolutionary lens. What's the survival value of moral behavior? And they conclude that morality likely predates organized religion.
So we didn't need religious commandments to figure out right and wrong.
Right. The basic building blocks were already there, shaped by evolution.
And those building blocks are family relationships and reciprocity.
Kin selection and reciprocal altruism are crucial for understanding cooperation. But in complex human societies, reputation becomes really important.
Because with language, we can spread information about each other's behavior.
So having a reputation as a trustworthy person, someone who reciprocates favors, becomes very advantageous.
Matt Ridley's book, The Origins of Virtue, explores this idea in depth.
It's a key work on evolutionary morality. The source also brings up this interesting idea that some seemingly altruistic acts, like charitable donations, might actually be displays of dominance or superiority.
It's like Thorstein Veblen's idea of conspicuous consumption, spending money to show off your wealth.
Exactly. Or Ahmad Zahavi's handicap principle, doing something costly to signal your fitness.
Like the Arabian babblers, those birds that feed their subordinates or take on risky roles to show their dominance.
Right, the cost of the act guarantees its honesty. Only truly superior individuals can afford to do those things. So how does this apply to humans?
Well, the source argues that in our evolutionary past, when we lived in small, isolated groups, all four types of altruism, kin selection, reciprocal altruism, reputational altruism, and this kind of competitive altruism were probably all at play.
And that explains why humans have this strong tendency toward in-group altruism and out-group hostility. It was beneficial to cooperate with your own group and be wary of outsiders.
But then why are we still often altruistic in large, anonymous cities today?
The idea is that natural selection favors general rules that promote survival and reproduction. But those rules can misfire in new environments.
It's like the cuckoo bird laying its eggs in another bird's nest. The other bird follows the rule to care for any chicks in its nest, even though the cuckoo chick isn't its own.
Exactly. So our evolved moral intuitions might not always be perfectly suited to the modern world.
Let's talk about some of those moral intuitions. The source discusses the famous trolley problem, which is a thought experiment designed to probe our moral instincts.
The basic scenario is this. A trolley is heading towards 5 people, but you can switch it to a sidetrack where it will kill only one person. Most people say it's okay to flip the switch.
But then there's the footbridge dilemma. You're on a bridge over the track, and the only way to stop the trolley is to push a large person off the bridge onto the track.
In that case, most people say it's not okay to push the person.
Even though the outcome is the same. 1 life saved, 5 lives lost.
Right. And there are variations of the trolley problem that are even more subtle, like the one with Ned and Oscar.
Ned can divert the trolley onto a sidetrack where it will hit a large person, but then the track loops back around and rejoins the main track before the 5 people.
Most people say Ned should not divert the trolley, even though it's essentially the same action as flipping the switch in the original dilemma.
So what explains these intuitions?
Well, one possibility is that we have this innate aversion to using a person as a means to an end. In the footbridge dilemma and the Ned-Oscar variation, you're deliberately using the large person to stop the trolley. But in the original switch dilemma, the person's death is a side effect, not the intended goal.
It's a fascinating area of moral psychology, and it raises the question of where we get our moral absolutes from.
If not from religion, then where?
Exactly. The source points out that it's hard to defend absolutist morals on non-religious grounds.
Patriotism is mentioned as one possible secular source of absolutism. But then there's that great quote from Luis Buñuel, "God and country are an unbeatable team. They break all records for oppression and bloodshed."
Sobering words. The source then turns its attention to the Bible itself, and it doesn't hold back.
There's a deliberate effort to confront some of the more disturbing passages, to question the moral standards presented.
Like the story of Lot and his daughters getting him drunk and having incestuous relations.
Or the story of the Levite and his concubine, where the men of Gibeah demand the guest for sexual abuse, and the host offers his own daughter and the concubine instead.
And then there's the story of Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac.
The author asks whether we should even take that story literally, and if it's allegorical, what's the supposed moral lesson?
The point is that we don't actually derive our moral principles from these stories. Or if we do, we're picking and choosing the parts that fit our pre-existing moral compass.
Right, we're using an independent moral criterion. And there are many other unsettling stories in the Bible, like Jephthah sacrificing his daughter because of a rash vow, or God's constant jealousy and wrath toward idol worship, like the golden calf incident.
Or the brutal commands to conquer the promised land, wiping out entire populations.
And the long list of offenses punishable by death in Leviticus.
Yeah.
Cursing your parents, adultery, homosexuality, working on the Sabbath.
It makes you wonder why anyone would base their lives on these examples. Why try to impose this morality on others?
The source then tackles the thorny issue of religion and violence, arguing that religion often exacerbates conflict.
The author says that no atheist would ever destroy a religious site like Mecca or Notre Dame.
And they quote Stephen Weinberg. Religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you would have good people doing good things and bad people doing bad things. But for good people to do bad things, that takes religion.
And there's a similar quote from Pascal. Men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction.
The source also discusses Philip Harton's work on in-group morality and out-group hostility, how it plays out in the Bible and throughout history.
Hartung has this darkly humorous example of a Baptist initiative to count the number of Alabamians in hell, using a secret formula that favored certain denominations.
It highlights this idea of us versus them that's so often present in religious thinking.
And then there are the Rapture-Ready websites with their predictions of the end times. It's a stark reminder of how religious beliefs can lead to extreme views.
So the question the source raises is, what's so respectable about religion, given all the violence committed in its name?
They talk about the problem of religious violence in India as a microcosm of the world's problems, saying the name of the problem is God.
Of course, in-group loyalty and out-group hostility exist without religion, but religion often amplifies them in dangerous ways.
By labeling outsiders as deserving of eternal punishment, by sanctioning violence in holy texts, and by creating taboos against intermarriage.
It reinforces those divisions, like the example of the Earl of Antrim facing disapproval for marrying a Catholic in Northern Ireland.
Or the anxieties about mixed marriages between Jews and non-Jews, with those worries about how the children will be raised.
It highlights the power of religion to create and maintain boundaries between groups.
But is there a way to have morality without religion? Can we have ethics without God?
The source suggests that we can. They talk about a consensual human ethic based on shared values of reciprocity, non-harm, truth-seeking, independent thought, and critical thinking.
It's not that different from what any decent person would come up with.
Right. And they mention John Rawls' idea of creating norms as if you don't know your place in society.
Like the Inuit custom of the person who cuts the food, choosing last.
It's a way to ensure fairness.
Of course, ethical progress takes time. Even enlightened figures from the past held views we would now consider racist.
It's a reminder that morality is not static, it evolves.
The source then brings up a really stark example of how religious belief can clash with science. The story of Kurt Wise, a student who chose scripture over evolution.
Wise was incredibly honest. He said that even if all the evidence pointed to evolution, he'd still believe in creationism because that's what the Bible says.
It shows the power of faith to override evidence. And it leads to some truly disturbing consequences, like the persecution of Alan Turing.
Turing, who played a crucial role in breaking the Nazi codes during World War II, was prosecuted for being gay and driven to suicide.
It highlights the obsession with other people's private lives that's so common in religious moralizing.
Like the Westboro Baptist Church, with their hateful protests at funerals.
The source then discusses the abortion debate and how it often revolves around the question of when life begins.
Religious opponents of abortion take an absolutist stance. An embryo is a baby, and killing it is murder. End of discussion.
And that leads them to oppose embryonic stem cell research, even though it has the potential to save lives.
It also creates an inconsistency with IVF, where multiple embryos are created and often discarded.
What about the cases where the mother's life is at risk?
The source presents a thought experiment, a woman with serious health problems, and asks what the moral course of action is.
They then take an evolutionary perspective, arguing that there's no absolute moral distinction between an embryo and, say, a fetus that's further along in development.
It's a continuum. We share a common ancestry with other animals, so drawing a sharp line becomes very difficult.
It's like imagine encountering a group of Australopithecus afarensis. Would they have the same moral status as us? Where do we draw the line?
It's a slippery slope.
The source then turns to the dangers of unquestioning faith, using the example of the London bombings.
Sam Harris argues that simply calling the bombers evil doesn't explain their actions. We need to understand the ideology that motivated them.
And both Christianity and Islam teach that faith is a virtue, even when it means ignoring evidence or reason.
That's a dangerous message. It creates fertile ground for extremism.
And then you have those religious leaders who condemn the violence after it happens, but who also promote the very ideas that led to it.
It's a vicious cycle.
There's even a computer game, Left Behind, Eternal Forces, where players fight a religious war to convert or kill those who don't share their beliefs.
It's a disturbing reflection of the us versus them mentality that religion can foster.
Let's talk about the fear of hell. It's a very real fear for many people, even those who are otherwise rational.
The source mentions a woman who was traumatized by the hellfire teachings in Catholic school, even though she understood evolution.
And there's Jill Mitten's account of her childhood, dominated by the fear of eternal damnation.
It's a stark reminder of the psychological power of these beliefs.
The source argues that children have a right not to be indoctrinated with these kinds of harmful ideas.
It's like we don't let parents pull their children's teeth or lock them in dungeons. Why should we allow them to fill their minds with fear and guilt?
There's this chilling example from the documentary Ice Maiden, where viewers are asked to admire the Inca priests and the supposed pride of the child being sacrificed.
It's a horrific act of child abuse, and there's nothing positive about it.
Children should have the right to decide for themselves what they believe.
The source discusses the case of Wisconsin v. Yoder, where Amish parents were allowed to withdraw their children from school for religious reasons.
It raises questions about balancing cultural practices with children's rights to education and choice.
Should children have a say in their own upbringing?
Another case study in the conflict between religion and science is the Emmanuel College controversy, where the science director was removed for teaching creationism.
Stephen Layfield claimed that the Bible is the full source of truth, rejecting the idea that science can reveal anything about the world.
And the head teacher, Peter Vardy, denied that they were promoting creationism, but a student contradicted him.
It raises questions about honesty and integrity in education.
The source then introduces this idea of childism, the practice of labeling children with religious affiliations.
They argue that it's wrong to impose those labels on children who are too young to understand what they mean.
It's jarring to hear terms like Christian child or Muslim child. We don't do that with political beliefs.
They propose an alternative: child of Christian parents or child of Muslim parents.
That acknowledges the parental influence without defining the child's identity.
It allows children to make their own choices when they're older.
Now, the source doesn't argue for a complete rejection of religion. They acknowledge the cultural impact of the Bible, for example.
Right. They list all these common English phrases that come from the Bible.
And they argue that knowing the Bible can enrich your understanding of literature and history.
Like the witty verse by Lord Justice Bowen, playing on a line from Matthew.
Or Eliza Doolittle's fantasy in My Fair Lady, which alludes to the fate of John the Baptist.
So even atheists can appreciate the Bible as a cultural artifact.
And you can value those cultural traditions without believing in the supernatural claims.
You can give up God without losing your history.
The source then discusses the phenomenon of imaginary friends. Expert.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel